Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the final session of Source ZeroCon 2023. As we wrap up this Source ZeroCon, I wanted to take a moment really and look back at the week, at some of the thought leadership that was shared, the technical challenges and the solutions, and see if I could put some of that in context of how this rapidly changing and evolving threat landscape is going to impact cybersecurity, cyber insurance, and really how the two industries work together. So for those that don't know me, my name is Bill Young. I've been with Optiv for 15 years. I'm our managing partner of our threat and AppSec businesses, and really out in front working with our clients day in, day out to build and solve more complex challenges that are facing us every day. I also started the Source ZeroCon initiative back in 2020. So this is our third Source ZeroCon, and want to welcome and thank everybody for attending and participating in all the events and games and activities and conversation that has been going on this week. But let's dive in. Let's talk about cyber insurance. So what I wanted to do first is maybe talk a little bit about how we got here. Because if you look at cyber insurance historically, it's not an industry, or insurance historically, it's not really an industry that is accustomed to change. Insurance has been around for about 350 years. Ben Franklin actually started the Philadelphia Contributorship in 1952, which is the oldest running active insurance agency in the United States at the moment. In '97, we had the beginnings of what is now our modern cyber insurance. So at that time, it was really focused on professional liability, on software and media issues, and those kinds of liability-related insurance protections. Clearly, in the last 25 years from that point to now, it has continued to evolve and change shape very quickly. But it's really in its infancy. Historically, the insurance industry was not accustomed to an industry that changes this rapidly. It's an industry focused on stable bets, on being able to predict and understand the risk of an incident, right, of a claim. So whether it's if there's going to be a car accident at a certain intersection or hail damage in a neighborhood, these are the kinds of things that through actuarial tables, through historical knowledge, the industry is able to predict. But we can see where that's going to create challenges from a cybersecurity perspective. So as we look back at the past couple of years, well, I mean, what's happened in the 26 years since cyber insurance really became a thing? Not only did that industry evolve, but so did our threats. So did the way we faced issues here from a cybersecurity perspective. Everything started with a very traditional perimeter network, right? It was, I've got a couple of web apps, I've got some inbound connectivity, and a very traditional perimeter network. We saw web apps targeted, right? So early attacks were very much focused on attacking databases, attacking payment systems, focused on credentials, for example. But then things really started to escalate in 2014 as things started to go mainstream, right? We saw major retail attacks. We saw healthcare going down, government and technology attacks, and then 2017 major credit reporting agencies targeted. So as all of this has evolved, imagine this from an insurance perspective, right? You've got what you're trying to build as a predictable model, and then regular change going on year over year. 2020, things start to get even worse as we see ransomware spike, and those payments, right? The issues associated with ransomware start to change the conversation altogether. At this point, premiums start to skyrocket, and the questions around the future of cyber insurance start to become really valid, right? This becomes that conversation that we're having here today, started probably in 2020 with that evolution. But then it gets worse, right? Because as we plan out and build around the ransomware related issues and that conversation from 2020, throw 2021 in. Now we've got the SolarWinds attack and the idea of supply chains starting to become a mainstream conversation, and in addition to that threat landscape or things that you need to be worrying about when looking at your insurance program. Finally, 2022, We add log4j to the mix and we start thinking about shared libraries, shared threats, third-party risk comes back into focus as we think about that from an insurance perspective. And then, I mean, the perimeterless future, right? As we continue to think about global attacks, things moving out to the cloud, we continue to do pen tests and build the security around our perimeter, but the reality is our perimeter is expanding all over the place. We are taking our data and we are shifting it out to many major SaaS providers, for example. So as the attack vector continues to expand, as our data continues to evolve and move and spread, this insurance conversation becomes much more complicated. So I know when I started talking about this, my focus was to look at this from a crystal ball perspective. Where are we going to be able to bring this together? Is there a future in this industry, and what does it look like? So we'll get there here in a little bit. But as we think about how do we align it, right? How do we bring these two industries together? Because that's the challenge at the moment. We've got a cyber insurance or a cybersecurity space, something that all of us are involved in from a day in, day out perspective, that understand threats, that understand the technical complexities facing our clients, our companies, the industry as a whole, and the shifts and how that potentially changes that threat landscape or the risk profiles. And you've got that carrier industry that's looking for predictability. They're looking for that statistics-driven approach to understand trends, to understand all of the costs associated with an incident, where that's a changing and moving conversation. So given this evolution, people are thinking about it totally differently, right? From a cyber perspective, we're concerned about our budget. Where do we invest? How do we focus? We've got this misalignment potentially within our organization that I'll talk about here in a second, but something where our CFO is buying insurance. So now we've got the CFO buying insurance, communicating with the CISO and the security team and trying to understand how this all plays together into that larger conversation. So with that, and we think about these different networks and we think about these different connections, one of the things that I started doing is really spent this week looking at the talks and thinking about the talks as they related to this problem. I started to pull 4 major themes out of all the red team talks from the week. So on one hand, you have AI. AI was a part of 5 different talks this week. It's relevant, it's current, and if you think about it from an insurance perspective, we haven't scratched the surface. Right? We haven't had our ransomware incident or our supply chain incident to that level from an AI perspective. So now we've got an insurance industry that's used to car accidents, and we're thinking about AI and how that's going to evolve. Social engineering, for example, deep fake phone calls, phishing attacks, all of those start to change the way we think about the threats and the potential future cost models. Cloud, I mentioned before, there were 4 different attacks really focused on, or 4 different conversations and presentations really focused on cloud attacks because our data continues to shift. Our threat vectors continue to evolve. Evasion is certainly a thing and certainly a continued theme. How are we bypassing EDR solutions, or what is that threat of bypassing solutions? How do we leverage things that may not even be vulnerabilities? The talk on using native tools, using the stuff built into the operating systems potentially against them in these conversations, creates a whole new level of complexity as we think about those threats and how do we build defensive strategies and use insurance as part of that risk transference model. And then finally, there were a number of just emerging topics that are barely even on the radar from an insurance perspective. Thinking about critical infrastructure, right? That insurability from a critical infrastructure perspective is going to be a topic for years to come, and one that may or may not even be an insurable industry here in the future. But then you throw in hospital systems and patient networks, all the different environments that are focused on potential threats that may not be traditional, that may not be predictable, or that are going to be tough for us to build some sort of modeling around in time. On the blue team, we continued to see similar trends. So we had vuln management really driving that conversation around machine learning, AI. How do we get more effective with those tools? So now we've taken that AI conversation, we flipped it to start to maybe provide more value, more risk reduction, more predictability, more solutions in the process. That plays into this conversation too. Intelligence. Intelligence is an area where, from an insurance perspective, I want to see continued investment, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. But being able to build scoring mechanisms to be able to understand what those threats and risks are, and being able to use an intel-driven approach to build predictability, something far beyond what we're doing today in terms of basic perimeter availability and basic vulnerability scanning, right? Starting to take true intelligence, understanding the state of the world, understanding how these different things play into an insurance-driven conversation or really a risk measurement conversation. Incident response was really back to basics in many cases. It was about taking those business email compromises, those ransomware readiness type solutions, and fitting those into the theme of insurance. Because if we have unknown attacks and we don't know where the next thing's coming from, now we have to start to think about how do we take those various threats and we reduce the impact of them. So when that next thing does happen, we know we can recover quickly. We know that we've got strategies for isolation or to limit the impact, and a well-practiced muscle memory response effort. And then finally, application security. Application security is a space where, given the volume of applications and the explosion of applications, it's tough to keep up, right? So changing that conversation from scanning later to building strategies up front to having that developer security culture, right? To creating that approach to be able to embed security into everything we do. Looking at low-code, no-code solutions and how do you reduce your risks there. Software bill of materials from a third-party perspective. So when you take these kinds of conversations and you think about the evolution from an insurance perspective, now we're kind of in a tale of two conversations. One where we can manage and reduce the impact of risk, and one where those threats are evolving at a pace that are outpacing the way we calculate the cost models associated with insurance today, which is why we've seen the rapidly fluctuating premiums here in the past couple of years. So I talked about our space. I talked about, from a cybersecurity perspective, what are we seeing in this week's themes or in this year's Source Zero Con analysis. But let's look at the industry. Let's look at insurance. How is it lining up to everything that I just talked about? So of course, the first problem or the first challenge that we have to overcome are questionnaires. I heard recently, and I haven't seen it, but that one of the questionnaires had passed 500 questions. I think one of the challenges that we're having because of this rapid evolution is that we're chasing our tail a little bit, right? That from an insurance industry perspective, we are seeing the latest threats or the evolving trends and trying to get our hands around each one of them from that perspective of either more security controls, more analysis, more understanding, and then being able to build in trends and strategies from a reduction perspective. Good news is most of the insurance industry really is boiling this down to those 10 or so major cyber insurance controls that Dara talked about earlier this week. So building strategies there can help manage this process, but there are still alignment issues in question here, right? Because being able to look at the underlying issues and say, hey, I have an MFA strategy or a PAM strategy. So my identity program is built to help me be insurance ready is a great start. But then being able to connect that into that underwriter conversation, being able to take those things and fill in the blanks, right? Be able to take that and apply it to these questions, to the root cause of what the insurance company is looking at and that strategy going forward. So these questions, I mean, they're just not enough, right? It's not a good way to measure out, it's not enough of a way to measure out the effectiveness of a program and to capture the nuance of the solutions that many of us are putting in place, and then to understand where those gaps are and what strategies and where to prioritize. On top of that, I mentioned earlier, a lot of people in the conversation, right? So on the left side, where we've got many of you, we've got our partners, whether they're our vendors or other third-party relationships. We've got obviously the end user threats and everything that we are focused on from a day-to-day basis, and our entire security strategy. And then the CFO sits in the middle, right? So the CFO is working with the broker, the carriers, the underwriters. If we're lucky, we're in that conversation. But because of all the people in the mix and the number of folks that we have to look at in terms of sharing and being able to communicate that strategy, there's a lot potentially lost in the telephone game. This is why we need more predictability when going through this process, a better strategy than just here's a questionnaire, but really that whole proposal, that conversation, that approach to being able to communicate what it is that's going on. How is it that we are building a defensive strategy? What residual risk exists? And then being able to communicate all that into something that creates a viable program, that you're not going to have risks of not being covered, that you understand what types of exclusions are in place, and then what your premiums and overall coverage limits are. So, I make it sound easy. Hey, take 10 controls, build a strategy. There's a lot of challenges, right? Because the insurance industry is complicated. It's got its own controls that it's trying to figure out in a changing cybersecurity space. And then, of course, our cybersecurity space is not easy. There's a lot of moving parts in the process. But one of the things it really comes down to is trust, right? So every time there's an incident, the carriers are adding more questions or are digging deeper in certain areas around some of that. So we're operating reactively. But the idea of let's look at the program, let's look at the strategy doesn't translate well into a insurance premiums conversation. On the other side, of course, well, we're all paranoid by trade, and just in general, the risk of saying something that might cause us to not be insurable or the premiums to go up or anything like that also causes a scenario where we're very guarded. And that lack of trust leads to people not talking to each other, which is really driving prices higher as well. Most of the CISOs I talk to when I'm out talking cyber insurance right now that tell me that their premiums went down come from the fact that they had a well-strategized plan, that they were able to go in and articulate and answer the questions in those conversations with the underwriter that went beyond the questionnaire, that they were able to show the strategy, the approach, the plan that they had. So being able to build up that conversation rather than tear it down is going to be a key to solving for some of these complexities. Of course, problem 3, we don't have historical data. 26 years is nothing. 26 years where the space has evolved and reinvented itself every 2 to 3 years is really nothing. I mean, from a disruptive change perspective, this industry's changed probably more than the cyber insurance industry or the insurance industry has changed in the past 300 years. So given that rapid rate of change, the insurance company is going to need some evolution and to need to rethink how we do this as well. And what that, of course, means is exclusions. Well, if it can't be covered, we'll exclude it, right? So those exclusions continue to become a rising issue, and a rising issue where maybe as people are evolving or evaluating their policy, those exclusions are getting missed, right? So I know there have a couple of claims recently where things weren't covered because in the past year or two, more exclusions have been added to the policies or more rules, more structure. And that comes from all the rapid change, the addition of questions, the changing model or the changing threat landscape, and all of those different things happening. And then finally, I mean, we're one catastrophic incident away from really breaking the entire insurance space, right? So the idea here that we could have some sort of major incident is not out of the realm of possibility, which means there's a number of caps and protections and the like that have to be put in place, because we face the next, you face the next major attack, that thing on the landscape or on the horizon that many of us know are possible, run that risk of breaking the industry, which means we need our strategy to be able to protect against that as well. And to not have all our eggs in one basket, or to not look at, oh, I moved the risk over to the cyber insurance space, I'm safe. It all plays into what is a really big challenge in the next couple of years for the cybersecurity and cyber insurance space. So let's look at what we can be doing right now. I'm sure there's a couple of folks in the insurance industry on the call today. So let me start there. From an insurance perspective or an industry perspective, recommendation number one is we've got to improve our partnership. We've got to improve our partnership with the insureds and our ability to have more intelligent conversations, to be able to digest and understand beyond the answer to a question, compensating controls, security strategies, and be able to recognize the gaps, the deficiencies, and to be able to build up better measurement statistics and measurement programs. Number two, the insurance industry isn't talking to the insurance industry, which is something a little bit unique to this over some of the other insurance spaces or that we've talked about before. There's a lot of sharing and a lot of historical knowledge that is very broad in homeowners insurance, in auto insurance, in business liability insurance. We don't have that in cyber insurance. There's not much consistency from one insurance carrier to another. There is an opportunity to pull some of that together and to start looking at like strategies and some knowledge sharing in order to be able to build up a better data set quicker. So I think that's the next piece that the insurance company evolution is going to be heading, or has got to head toward, for this to be sustainable in time. The third one is aligning requirements to spend. So what do I mean by this? Many times the insurance, we all have cyber budgets. No one has cyber budgets that are big enough. Money is being spent, things are being improved every year. So how do we take the insurance company's requirements and what is needed and work with or provide information that is valuable in order to be able to help define the direction of that spend going forward? So more conversation and more thoughts around, hey, people are spending money on cybersecurity. How do we build up and provide information as to how that could both be effectively used? Same thing goes for these free services. One of the things that I see a lot of the insurance carriers doing is offering out free services, right? A free tabletop exercise, free vulnerability scanning. But then I also, as I talk with carriers and brokers, I hear a lot of conversations of nobody uses them. People don't take us up on them. Well, are they the services that are of real value? Back to that question of spend, in terms of being able to use that value and provide, help further somebody's security program. Maybe instead of focusing on some of those types of services that may be low value because of what's already being spent, particularly for larger clients, maybe focus on better threat intelligence. Things like the talks that we were talking about a little earlier today. Being able to understand where is the industry going? What is that next threat landscape? I was at the Net Diligence Cyber Insurance Conference a few weeks back, and folks were talking AI, right? That was the big topic. But are folks talking AI with their clients? Are they releasing strategies and recommendations for how to use some of that spend and some of that strategy to be out in front of that to reduce the impact of the next test? So threat intelligence and more forward-looking R&D and more forward-looking vision in that R&D cybersecurity space be hugely valuable to the cybersecurity industry. So anywhere we're shifting that R&D spend, shifting that to align to the client's programs and the client's budgets, and the overall program would be really helpful. So what can we be doing from a security practitioner side? I mean, the first one is nothing new, attack surface reduction. We've done a fairly good job of managing things like shadow IT in the past couple of years, and getting it back to the point that we at least have control over our own attack surface and we understand our own attack surface. But now we've got the new problem of the perimeterless network, right? We've got more in the cloud. We've got more out on GitHub. We've got more third-party integrations. Well, all of those create potential points of entry and potential risk and potential measurement points from a cybersecurity or cyber insurance perspective. So the more we can do to understand what APIs are we exposing, what is our strategy there? Do we have a hardening approach for it? Anywhere we can reduction reduces risk, right? This is nothing new, but it's an area that we should be continuing to focus and communicating that back to the insurance industry. Limiting attacker movement. This one's huge. This is something that I talk to every client about all the time, which is when an attacker gains a foothold, look, let's face it, there will be a new O day where some user will click. So let's start from the question of when an attacker gains a foothold. What do, right? Password reuse, local admin reuse, reusing user employee accounts, whatever the case may be. Moving laterally and vertically through user accounts. So any type of privileged access management, account management is a really useful way to stop that lateral movement. IPv6, getting your hands on around IPv6 is the next way people move. And then of course, legacy protocols, right? Legacy protocols that none of us want to admit are still there, but that NetBIOS or whatever the case may be, that's still running on the network, that still allows you to use your own network against you. Every attacker is going to move through these kinds of techniques, right? That's the first thing that happens once that foothold is gained. There's not a lot of ways that people are moving laterally and vertically. Sure, starting to look for vulnerabilities becomes way number 4, but it's much easier to just move around the network using native capabilities. So figuring out what native capabilities attackers use, stopping them completely in our network, and then building alerting mechanisms that scream every time we see them are a great way to get our hands around it. And then cyber insurability controls. Like I said, Dara talked about a few of them earlier this week. Build that narrative, build that story, have a good strategy for all the major areas that are insurance focused, whether it's privacy, whether it's vuln management and remediation, really building around those common controls that the industry cares about and focusing your storyline there. And then finally, third parties, software bill of materials, APIs, third-party connections, right? All those things create those threats that come back to that attack surface reduction. All right, so to conclude, I mean, I want to talk, as we talk about this cybersecurity, cyber insurance piece, let's wrap this up by talking about where are we headed. This is that crystal ball part that I talked about earlier. I don't see cyber insurance going anywhere. There's too much money being thrown at that industry right now. There's too much money and investment and focus on being able to get our hands around it. But the risk, the rapidly evolving threat landscape is going to continue to wreak havoc on the insurance industry. That's not going to change, which means exclusions are going to continue to rise. We have to be very careful as we watch and evolve and negotiate and discuss all of that. These rapid changes will continue to be the threat and the risk to carriers, and those defensive strategies are going to be pushed back on us, which means we need to be able to manage that conversation and that relationship in order to be able to assure trust or ensure trust, and to be able to help provide that confidence and that approach to go forward. Deductibles are the next area that I think we're going to continue to see more rise in, which will be interesting because as deductibles rise, smaller attacks, business email compromise, those kinds of things may start to get excluded because they're just not big enough. And the cyber insurance may become much more of a catastrophe insurance focused on those really larger attacks. If that's the case, that's not the worst case scenario, but it does mean now we need to think about an alternative strategy. How are we reacting or responding to an incident that may be below the threshold that the insurance company is going to get involved in, which means now we've got to go back and look at those IR plans and playbooks and the involvement of third parties and support in the case of smaller incidents. Mature programs will continue to see value. Look, like I said, in the past year, I've talked to 3 different CISOs. I've had a chance to really sit down and interview and dig deep with 3 different CISOs around their program. And in all cases, they told me their cyber insurance premiums dropped this year. Premiums can drop, but it does involve that maturity and that program evolution and being able to present and communicate that going forward. Continuing that crystal ball piece, I think we'll continue to see many companies that maybe are a little bit less mature or that are struggling to align to whatever rigid parameters the insurance company has may start to shift away, which again leads to that strategy of if you're going to self-insure, that's great. But self-insurance is not just saying, hey, we're not going to buy insurance, we'll take the risk. Self-insurance is now building a self-insurance strategy, building a program for what is it that you're going to do in the case of an incident without that third-party cyber insurance safety net built into the program. So not having an insurance plan makes it even more important to really have that IR plans, the playbooks, exercise those tabletops, and make sure that you have a good defensive strategy and a good threat and risk reduction strategy in place to reduce your overall exposure. All right, so with that, that really concludes everything that I had to talk about today. Cyber insurance is going to be a space that, you know, like I said, 20 years ago, we were talking about liability protection. Today, we're talking about ransomware and third-party risk. 5 years from now, we're going to be having AI conversations, probably a lot faster than that at this pace. So thinking about that and looking at it as more than just something that happens once a year, but how it critically plays into your role and how it's going to evolve and change your security strategy, and really being out in front of that from a planning perspective is the key to a good program going forward. All right, so as I wrap, I want to do one last thing and shift gears for 2 seconds. I want to say thank you. First of all, thank you to everybody that attended Source Zero Con this week. Great attendance, great conversation, the participation in the capture the flag exercises. You know, we appreciate you. We can't do this without you. That's also true for our partners. Everybody who helped sponsor Source Zero Con 23, we appreciate you more than you can possibly imagine and look forward to continuing to work with you coming out of this and in the coming months and years. And then finally to our speakers. So for those of you that have made it this far, remember the folks that spoke mostly volunteered their time. This is stuff that's passion projects for them. They're things that are interesting and are opportunities for them to do research and to dig deeper, and they shared that. So take a moment, shoot them a thank you message, connect with them. This is something that they do because they're interested, they're passionate in, and they help bring and share with all of you. So again, I appreciate everyone and look forward to Source Zero Con 2024. Have a great afternoon.